Hello, I'm Nick Clark, bringing you Planet SOS from Madrid in Spain for the UN climate talks, where thousands of politicians and their negotiating teams are trying to agree on how to deal with the pressing issue of climate change. Principally asking the question how to cut greenhouse gas emissions and how to do it radically and fairly. We'll assess what's been achieved and we'll look ahead to next year, which is when the Paris Agreement that all nations signed up to 4 years ago kicks in. And we'll ask how much value there really is in huge conferences of thousands of delegates. Are they worth it? Especially when you consider the elephant in the room, the carbon footprint of this conference when nearly everyone flew in from across the world, including me. Welcome to Planet SOS. This is COP25. That is to say, the 25th time in 25 years that thousands of scientists, politicians, NGOs, yes, members of the press, have congregated to grapple with this issue that threatens us all. That is climate change. Things don't move fast in climate politics. On the agenda this time round, some of the most politically charged leftovers from last time that they're still trying to grapple with. First up, the rules on how the world trades in carbon. Then there's the delivery of a climate fund to help the world's poorest nations develop in a planet-friendly way. And then how to safeguard the world's most vulnerable people from the effects of climate change. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, how to encourage nations to cut emissions that are driving up global warming. There's a lot at stake here. The last 5 years have been the hottest on record. Sea levels are the highest in human history. 1 million species, more than 12% of all known life on Earth, is on the brink of extinction. Weather patterns are changing very visibly. Floods in East Africa have affected more than 3 million people and have killed at least 280. While bizarrely, 1,400 kilometres away, the mighty Victoria Falls have dwindled to a trickle as intense drought bites. We'll be hearing from our reporter Nick Hack on that in just a moment. But first, Andrew Thomas now reports on bushfires in Australia and how they're still burning.
It's impossible to make a direct link between climate change and any particular set of bushfires, let alone the awful smoke that hit Sydney for much of this week. But what scientists say is that climate change is making bushfires more frequent and making them more intense. Australia's government disagrees. The Prime Minister has really downplayed any link between climate change and the bushfires. He says to link the two would be to misconstrue the situation. And he has called the smoke that hit Sydney a mere haze, something to be expected from time to time. Australia's government is under real pressure over what many see as its lacklustre approach to the environment and emissions reductions. Scott Morrison, Australia's Prime Minister, makes the point that overall Australia only contributes perhaps 1.5% to the global total of emissions. There's little this country could do to make a practical difference to climate change. But many say that really misses the point. Australia needs to show leadership in this area because, as this week has shown, this is a country affected by climate change in a pretty profound way.
This is what remains of one of the waterways that lead to the Zambezi River. Normally, during this time of the year, it's overflowing with 8 meters of water above my head. But look at it now. Up ahead is the world's largest waterfalls, Victoria Falls. In some areas, it's a slow trickle. This isn't just a tourist attraction. It's a lifeline for millions of people beyond Zimbabwe's border who depend on it for food and power. But Southern Africa is going through its worst drought in a century. 14 countries and 45 million people are in need of help and are going hungry. Zimbabwe, who depends on water and its hydroelectric plant to power it, is going through severe power blackouts. In November, traditional and religious leaders gathered, invoking Nyami Nyami, the spirit of the Zambezi River, calling for the rains to come.
Okay, let's cross to Mariana now for more on the issues facing the planet.
Thanks, Nick. Our planet is heating up and fast. What once took hundreds of thousands of years has happened in less than 200, most of it in just the last 50. Levels of carbon dioxide have never been this high. The greenhouse gases we've pumped into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution have let the sun's light in, but stopped some of that heat escaping, and the global temperature has slowly ticked up, around 1 degree Celsius since 1880. Scientists say we're on track to hit 1.5 degrees in around 10 years, 3 degrees by the end of the century. Many scientists say it could go much higher. Now, those numbers may not seem like a lot, but the consequences of just a 0.5 degree rise will, for many of us, be catastrophic. For some parts of the globe, it already is. As the oceans heat, they expand. As they absorb more carbon dioxide, the more acidic they become. Large underwater areas are becoming uninhabitable. That heat is melting the world's ice sheets and glaciers. Satellite data shows losses from Greenland's ice sheet have doubled each decade since the 90s, to an average now of 250 billion tonnes of ice lost each year. That fresh water has to go somewhere, and it's pouring into our oceans.
The Greenland ice sheet is today the single largest contributor to sea level rise, and that's why there's a lot of attention on the Greenland ice sheet. It's a very dynamic ice sheet. It contains the fastest glaciers and is the ice sheet that is melting the most.
Sea levels have risen by at least 20 centimetres in the last 100 years. If we do nothing, that figure is expected to climb by around 1 metre by the end of this century, or by a worst-case scenario, a global sea level rise above my head. Coastal cities and communities will be swamped by the rising tide. This is the city of Miami as our planet warms. Even by conservative estimates, many island nations will cease to exist. Our planet's natural weather patterns are shifting. Expect droughts, floods, hurricanes, heat waves, storms and wildfires to become more frequent and more intense. All the while, we're burning through our planet's resources. And then there are the record levels of waste, pollution and plastic that are choking our planet. All of this makes a compelling case for action, the most urgent being to halve our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. But in the years since every nation pledged in Paris to do just that, levels of carbon dioxide have in fact gone up. The years since Paris have been volatile, backtracking on climate pledges, attacks on the climate science, and resistance to climate action. But a global movement has also grown, getting louder and more diverse by the day, and calling on us all to think about tomorrow. Scientists say this is a climate emergency, that there is still time to act, but that window is closing rapidly. The consequences of doing nothing will be catastrophic. For most of us, this will happen in our lifetimes.
So the next 12 months will be crucial. In 2020, we must deliver what the scientific community has defined as a must, or we and every generation that follows will pay an unbearable price.
The head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, he's been leading the charge for new, tougher climate pledges that would slash emissions. But a look at our data tracker here, and it's clear that needs to happen quickly. The World Meteorological Organization says levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have hit another record high this year. The safe level is around 350 parts of CO2 for every million air molecules. Levels are currently well above that. As a result, you can see the average global temperature has continued to rise, and sea levels too. The question is, will we rise to that challenge? Back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Mariana. Let's take a look now at where this conference is taking place. This is the IFEMA Exhibition Centre. It is a colossal hall that was provided by the Spanish government when Chile had to pull out because of ongoing protests there. And when I say colossal, I mean just that. It has got to be a kilometre from one end to the other. And here, 25,000 delegates go about the business of COP, which includes, of course, endless supplies of coffee and food as negotiations go from morning to late into the night. On any given day, there are all sorts of activities going on, not just negotiations, but also people pushing businesses and green solutions. Most countries have their national pavilions, some pretty extravagant affairs. And as you walk around these halls, there's all sorts of side events going on. Look at this. This is Barack Obama's former Secretary of State, John Kerry, holding forth.
We're not doing it with the intensity. Even if we did everything that was in the Paris Agreement, we're still at 3.7 degrees of warming.
Well, another way of achieving change is direct action like this. We've seen a lot of protests going on at this climate change conference in 2019. And in fact, this year, 2019, has been the year of street protests right around the world. But it's 2020 when the Paris Agreement really comes into effect and all this comes into focus. This year's talks are all about providing a springboard for next year's crucial climate summit in Glasgow, where national commitments to cut emissions must match the science. Otherwise, many believe we face runaway climate change. But the divisions, they're huge.
There's this absolute disconnect between the two. Firstly, the reality of the outside, the reality of climate impacts that I don't think there's a single country that can sit here and not say that there's been huge impacts. And then also the reality of the science. The science has been extremely clear about what needs to be done, and there's just a complete disconnect between those realities and this reality inside the venue. And we need to, as civil society movements, go back home and hold our governments accountable and already be in a position to ensure that there are consequences for their inaction. Because we're really talking about survival. This is a climate emergency, and their responses in this environment is not adding up.
There is room for solutions for sure, and the odd part for me as an analyst who studies the issues, what would it cost, how can we do this, is that we could make the transformation at a tiny, tiny cost and huge benefits. Most of the politicians are just ignorant. They have no idea what the alternatives are. They have no idea that at almost no cost or even savings, we have so much wind, so much solar, so much hydro potential, geothermal, other solutions that once you look at the facts, you say, are you kidding? We're going to let the planet go to ruin because we're not doing these obvious things? That's the ultimate reason for optimism, if I could put it this way. This is not hard to solve. But we have to get these dyspeptic politicians out of the way or teach them something, send them back to school so that they understand what this is about.
Now then, the problem is that the carbon footprint of this conference here in Madrid, with thousands upon thousands of delegates flying in, is absolutely astronomical. But no one's yet come up with a way of conference calling all these people over a 2-week period, so in they fly. In fact, transport accounts for a huge percentage of global CO2 emissions, with a third in the United States and a quarter in Europe. The distance between London and Madrid is 1,735 kilometres. A standard petrol-powered car on this journey would pump 347 kilograms of carbon into the atmosphere. With diesel, that drops to below 300, but that's still significant. Air travel, well, that's fast, but it's also costly to the planet. Not counting travel to and from the airport, an airliner on that route adds almost 120 kilograms for each passenger. That's many tons of CO2 into the atmosphere from one flight alone. A train is a good option, provided it's powered cleanly. In Europe, some trains run on gas or diesel, some are electric. To get to Madrid with current capabilities, the train adds 45 kilos of carbon per passenger. But train travel can be expensive. A cleaner option again is the bus, but the cleanest of them all is the electric car. But there's a catch. You'll need to charge up along the way, and that electricity has to come from somewhere. In the UK, about a third of electricity comes from zero-emission renewables. In France, around 3/4 of the energy is from zero-emission nuclear. And in Spain, about 40% comes from renewable energy, particularly wind. In Europe, only driving across Iceland could you be certain that your battery is charged 100% from renewables. But that's not going to help you get from London to Madrid. I have to say, in covering this story, we did attempt to take the train. We even bought rail tickets from London to Madrid, but then the French rail strike got in the way and we couldn't come by train, we had to fly. But it is something we have to consider more and more as we travel around the world as a TV channel, covering this important story of climate change and damage to the environment. We really do have to think, what is our carbon footprint as we book those air tickets? But there are some who can make it work and do make it work and have made the decision not to fly at all.
I'm Ben, I live in Bristol, and I choose not to fly. I'm a wood recycler. We collect wood waste from whoever's throwing it away. We bring it back to our yard, we clean it up and we sell it, and we make stuff out of it in the workshop. I don't fly because it's probably the heaviest carbon footprint that we create as individuals. Global warming and biodiversity loss are exacerbated by flying, so I've chosen to minimise my flying over the years. The journey I'm about to take, I'll leave Bristol tonight on a train from Bristol Temple Meads to London. I'll travel across London and stay with my brother in Brixton. Tomorrow morning I will take a bus to London St Pancras and I'll get on the 5:40 train to Paris. I will change at Paris to Paris Montparnasse. I will get on the TGV to Agen. I will change at Agen and I will go to Auch, and I arrive at Auch in the south of France at about 4 in the afternoon. I don't have a problem with a long journey as long as it's comfortable. Flights are so cheap, and that maddens me that it's so much cheaper to fly places than take the train. I have some remorse about the fact that Japan seems like a long way away. These are also products of a culture whereby we think it's some kind of entitlement that we should be able to see all these places. More people are aligning with me. I feel less alone than I did, say, a year ago. I also recognise that there's a bigger issue within society of no one wants to take the step forward unless everyone takes a step forward together. The actions of individuals have impact beyond what we might initially perceive. What do I miss about air travel? Very little.
So back in the conference centre, what is the status of the talks? Well, the truth is they've stalled. We've been speaking to Jennifer Morgan of Greenpeace, who's been following the arguments through the night.
Well, we are in these final hours where there's different little groups of negotiators optimally trying to strengthen a text that was put on the table a couple of hours ago, which was completely unacceptable. And so what's going on is you have actually, incredibly, Brazil and the United States trying to weaken these texts, and then you have the island nations, the European Union, trying to strengthen them. And for me, it's incredible that the US and Brazil are even being taken seriously here. One stepped out of the Paris Agreement, the other one clearly has no interest in saving the climate.
Now, science underpins all the negotiations here and just demonstrating what needs to be done, not least and perhaps the most threatened of the world's biospheres, the oceans. I recently joined an expedition to a newly discovered area of reef off the coast of French Guiana in South America. 135 kilometres off the coast of French Guiana, the Greenpeace campaign ship Esperanza. For now, a floating laboratory and expedition HQ to find out more about the newly discovered Amazon reef.
So the Amazon River and the Amazon mouth is here. The Amazon reef presence was first revealed 2 years ago off the coast of Brazil here, with the first Greenpeace expedition in the area. And a second Greenpeace expedition in the area last year identified the reef presence also into French Guiana waters.
Alexei Rosenfeld has dived all over the world, but this is something new. Along with his team, he's diving where no human has been before.
It's a real challenge to dive in conditions that no one knows. No one has ever dived here before. We have to go through a really thick layer of sediment from the Amazon mouth. This layer is about 20 meters deep, and after that it's pitch black until the bottom.
So there they go, and they'll be heading down to a depth of 110 meters, which is so deep they'll only have 15 minutes on the seabed, and in that time they've got to collect samples and send them back up to the surface. And then they have to stay in the water submerged for 3 hours to decompress. They drop down and down into almost complete darkness, the scene lit by their dive lights. At the bottom, they have to work fast, collecting biological samples. Other divers scan the reef and film it for review, revealing a rich array of biodiversity. The samples are sent up to the surface. Our boat heads over to pick them up and we haul them on board. And they arrive back on the Esperanza for initial analysis by the scientists. There's all manner of life here, including mollusks, crustaceans, sponges and starfish. And are you finding species that you don't recognise as well?
Oh, plenty, because this is all deep sea stuff, so very few people know them. It's very rare.
These waters are full of life, right on the migratory route of whales, turtles and other marine species. The expedition is gathering evidence to protect the area. It's not far from prospective oil drilling sites in Brazilian waters.
It gives more argument to the global call for marine conservation and creating marine protected areas. This is one of the kind of priority area we need to protect in the world, because you have iconic species, you have vulnerable ecosystem, so that's a way to call the global leaders for marine protection.
Now, taking on the environmental and climate crises is a battle on many fronts, not least that of the ocean. But the thing is, where scientists want to explore and document, oil companies want to come and drill. And these polar extremes are replicated across the climate debate. Now, 2019 has been the year of the global climate protests, and just in the past week we've seen hundreds of thousands of people marching on the streets of Madrid and in cities around the world. Well, earlier I caught up with Vanessa Nakate, who's part of that global movement. We first spoke to her back in September, and this is what she had to say a few months on. So, being part of this movement, how does it make you feel when you get that sense of urgency and then you come here and you see how the decision-making process is really slow?
We had our hope built up because our leaders kept on telling us that they were happy about our actions and the fact that we were creating awareness for climate change, and then we come here and we get the opposite of what they said. Is so disappointing. It almost feels like they lied to us and just failed us once again.
You must have learnt a lot on your travels on this recent experience. What are you going to do with that experience when you go back home?
I'm planning to start an action that will be going on every week to try and involve people, because many people are afraid of the strikes. They can't really go to the streets to strike because of the police, but I'm thinking of an action that will actually bring them together, not just in Uganda but across Africa, so that they may be able to do something that will bring climate action to try and secure the future, because not all of us can save the planet through strikes. We can still save the planet through other actions.
Vanessa Nakate there. The irony is how this conference has concluded is very different from the spirit of all those climate protests that we've seen throughout 2019. This conference was supposed to be about entering the sunlit uplands of international cooperation in the fight against climate change. What we got was something quite different. Here on Planet SOS, we've seen up close the very issues at stake. The growing threats of living in a warming world, especially for the poor and most vulnerable, who are being left to fight a battle not of their making.
Then it is so decided.
When the gavel eventually came down here in Madrid, it laid bare the widening chasm between what science says needs to be done and what a hardcore group of countries like the United States, Brazil or Australia are prepared to accept. For them, national interest comes before an existential threat to humanity and the planet we live in. Well, here at Al Jazeera, we'll continue to keep the climate and the environment right at the top of the agenda. That's it for this programme, and indeed this series of Planet SOS. We're going to leave you with some voices, some thoughts on the way forwards and on the planet we live on. From me, Nick Clark, it's goodbye for now.
Today we take a stand for Mother Nature. Mother Nature is lamenting and we are grieved.
We've done everything, and now the only thing we can do is civil disobedience.
In the 6 years that have passed since I was here the first time and this year, I have seen with my own eyes the effects, the terrible effects of climate change.
We are here because we care about the future of our children and their children's children.
We are demanding our right to live and our right to a future.
You gotta have the thing in your mind as a goal of your life to improve the environment.
The way we're going to change our culture is through politics and through our economy and through investing in different industries besides oil.
Save the climate! Save the climate! Save the
clock is ticking, and the future generations have to be assured a healthy planet, just as we have lived and the past generations have.
Nós queremos viver na nossa terra em paz. Nós queremos viver na nossa terra livres.
We are humans who do not deserve to suffer a crisis that we did not create.
It is us, the people, who are the hope. It is we who can make the changes.